If you really want to do what I do, you have to be prepared for anything. You're a Viltrumite. We have responsibilities.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom, and whoo boy, remember how we were reacting to the first episode of Invincible? How we thought that was crazy? We were so innocent. But honestly, I don't know what more this finale could have done. I know sometimes Invincible kind of follows archetypes, even if it's to subvert them, but they definitely threw out the guideline here, and it works. Everything leading up to this episode laid the groundwork for a story that stands on its own, and the typical formats that we're used to just wouldn't do it justice. The good guys didn't win, the bad guys bad, but it's more complicated than that, and there's nothing satisfying about the content of what happened in this episode, which is how it should have been, and yet the narrative still manages to give us some sense of closure. It helps that they went the route of Castlevania Season 2, where after the final conflict was resolved, they had an extra episode to breathe, except since the episodes for Invincible are about 40 minutes, that's what the second half of the finale was for. Just dealing with the fallout of events, and taking the first steps in moving forward, which on top of everything this episode did to make us want to see what happens next, they made a montage to acknowledge everything that was established this season, and how that's all moving forward, even if the narrative of this episode didn't touch on those things specifically. They made an effort to minimize loose ends, which is admirable since a lot of season finales and even series finales tend to just be like, yo, remember that thing we touched on? No you don't, forget about it, don't worry about it, buy our streaming service. And Mark talking to Seth Rogen Alien Man at the end of the episode with a glimmer of hope gives enough levity to digest the absolute horror we just witnessed.
Can't imagine what you're going through. Literally. Like, I have no concept of it. With my homeworld gone, my people had to create breeding camps just to stop us from going extinct.
This is really a great finale because of the fact that an episode like this wouldn't work if it wasn't for the amount of context built leading up to it. Because it really didn't do anything too complex. It was very simple and straightforward because after everything that happened, that was all there was left to do with these characters. Just be raw and honest.
I spent so much time thinking about if Nolan had killed the Guardians and why he would have done it. I didn't think about what would happen afterwards.
So in the end, I'm not left wondering, what about X, Y, and Z? I'm mostly just wondering, what's next? Like, is Immortal still alive after dying and then coming back to immediately get bodied again? And if he is, what role is he gonna play in this post-Omni-Man world? Also, Amber and Mark seem to be back together, which might not be the best idea. Sure, now she's probably adjusted her expectations of him and she's decided that she's willing to deal with his whole situation, but I don't know, at the end of the day, they're fictional characters who have their own things going on in this imaginary world. They can do what they want. It's not my business.
Does this mean,
I mean, if you want.
But what about...
Said your dad was killed when a gas line blew up across the street. Not that hard to figure it out from there.
And to be honest, most of what this show does I really just kind of accept because of the fact that it makes a point to be so grounded. Like, generally my expectations for stories are that they have more polish, but Invincible neglects that in a way that just feels so human that I just end up accepting it. Like, the blood splatter in Guardians HQ seemed like it was going to have some big ceremonious moment where they've earned the right to clean it, but instead it was just like, you know what, we've busted our ass and we're tired of looking at this, so let's just get rid of it at this point, which absolutely didn't feel earned. And they blatantly acknowledged that, but the sense of who cares at this point was so genuine that it was just like, okay, guess that's what we're doing.
I said stop! Now we look like a team.
But of course, the interesting thing about this episode is that we learned about Omni-Man's true origin. We previously learned that Viltrum was a utopian planet of superpowered beings that achieved a level of civilization far beyond that of Earth, which would, of course, cause them to progress much faster as far as infrastructure, technology, etc. However, now we learn that's not quite as utopian as it was described. Nolan now reveals the dark history of Viltrum that included purging the weak in a Darwinistic, or actually more eugenic process since it's so deliberate, and on top of that, Viltrum has a very imperialist and colonial perspective on interplanetary affairs that has left behind a path of blood, destruction, and overall suffering.
We decided to make it the only empire in our galaxy. Some species resisted, of course, but no one could withstand us for long.
There are a lot of parallels to some pretty objectionable real-world ideologies in the description we have of Viltrum and what it means to be a Viltrumite, but for the most part, it's implied, aside from the eugenics and imperialism stuff, which is pretty outright. But on top of that, those things tend to be paired with the concept of a master race, which makes Nolan's pride and loyalty to his heritage kind of uncomfortable. The fact that he justifies cold-blooded murder by dismissing the value of human life because they aren't Viltrumites and therefore are inferior beings, like, I don't think I need to explain what real-world concept that's emulating and why that's really bad.
These people are meaningless. but I'm loyal to Viltrum, not this pathetic excuse for a civilization. I will burn this planet down before I spend another minute living among these animals.
In addition, some of Nolan's statements and behavior may say something about the broader culture and ideas of Viltrum, or it may be a result of Nolan's individual circumstances and worldview, but with how militarized and homogenous Viltrum seems to be, there's probably not a wide spectrum of perspectives. Regardless, Nolan definitely has a ton of toxic masculinity. And obligatory acknowledgement that mentioning toxic masculinity doesn't mean I think masculinity in itself is intrinsically toxic. For example, Mark showed traits of masculinity in this episode that were very noble and empathetic as a foil to his father, but there are very toxic interpretations of what it means to be a man, and Nolan definitely holds the values of those interpretations.
Your life has been soft and painless. You're a Viltrumite in blood only.
For example, trying to completely dismiss his emotions and attachments to Earth for a blind loyalty to his home planet, and having that be so ingrained into his values that he's projecting that onto Mark. He has all of these justifications for why it doesn't make sense for Mark to fight for the human race and protect Earth because his emotional attachment doesn't outweigh a perceived truth about what actually matters, and Nolan is treating everything he's doing, all the things he knows are bad, with an attitude of a man has to do what a man has to do. He can't let a sense of empathy or morality get in the way of what he sees as facts. The facts that humans are inferior to Viltrumites, or the fact that it's not worth valuing his connections to people who he's going to see die, or the fact that humans are expendable because they aren't actually doing anything of value with their lives anyways. But then he brings those facts to Mark, and Mark starts challenging them, and makes it clear that maybe those ideas, or at least the value he attaches to them, aren't as objective as he thought. But allowing himself to understand that would mean coming to terms with the gravity of his actions, which understandably seems impossible, and putting myself in Nolan's shoes for a second, I honestly wouldn't know how to face this stuff either, unless I also had some insane delusions about morality. Which brings me to the fact that Invincible uses violence incredibly effectively. It may seem like all the blood and gore only exists for shock value, but it's important to understand that in every big superhero story where they're fighting a big bad guy in a heavily populated area, this is the stuff that we don't see. They even try to convey that in modern superhero films, like with Batman vs. Superman, showing Bruce Wayne on the ground during the events of Man of Steel, or Tony Stark in Civil War having to face the relative of a civilian who died during the final battle in the first Avengers movie. But there's a big difference between acknowledging casualties and showing casualties. The fact that a character can have a scene where they're almost treated as an equal to Mark when he's trying to save them, and then they're dead seconds later, has a much different emotional impact than hearing a number of people who died because Superman or the Avengers were too focused on fighting to consider civilian casualties. It reminds me a lot of how Miyazaki never portrays violence in his films in a way that is overly dramatic or glorifying, just very frank and honest. And that forces the audience to sit there and process on their own how disturbing that imagery actually is. By making these scenes so uncomfortable to watch, Invincible is forcing the audience to understand just how evil someone has to be to cause this much carnage and suffering. It's not just a laser beam and an explosion with the implication that people died. It's identifying with the human emotions of a character and then seeing them just not be alive anymore. And that also makes it really difficult to entertain the possibility of Omni-Man being redeemed. It's already fair to say that after everything is done, nobody is obligated to forgive him no matter how much he might change in the future. But even if he's not forgiven, is it possible for him to change enough to own up to his actions? To at least be able to live with himself and maybe possibly be accepted by the people close enough to still care about him? Because as awful as his actions are, you can tell he isn't too far gone yet. He's shown that he's still capable of remorse and at least values the relationship he has with his son as much as he wishes he didn't, which is probably a mutual feeling. I mean, Debbie revealed after everything was said and done that even after all of that, part of her just wants Nolan to come back and for things to go back to how they were.
I can't believe our time together was a lie. I wish he'd come back.
She clearly cared a lot about their relationship, and like we said in the last video, emotions don't always make sense. So even if she has the ability to make difficult, educated decisions that prioritize her well-being, there will always be part of her that deeply loved Nolan. And Mark is probably in that same boat. He looked up to his dad, not like a superhero, but literally as a superhero. A lot of the trauma he's going to face after everything that happened in this episode is going to be tied to a tremendous amount of disappointment in his father and hero, both letting him down and nearly killing him.
What will you have after 500 years?
You, Dad. I still have you.
And even with that, I'm sure he still looks up to his dad in some shape or form, even if he doesn't want to. So yeah, I'm not a mental health professional or any type of professional really, but that's a really rough situation. And I don't think it's my place to prescribe what should be done about that. Obviously, there's a strong attachment between these characters that has been put through a lot, and that is going to be really hard for everyone involved to just move on from. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments down below. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Twitch at TommyPQM, or you can find the Roundtable at Roundtable Vids on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Roundtable and hit the bell for notifications to never miss a video. Shout out to all our patrons on Patreon. My name is Tom. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day. See ya!